Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the 20th of July, 1863. In the blood-soaked aftermath of America's bloodiest battle, Captain Nathaniel Reed documented 47 separate encounters with soldiers who had died weeks before. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of war that never truly ends, and the dead who refuse to leave the field of battle. The setting sun painted long shadows across the killing fields of Gettysburg as Captain Nathaniel Reed made another notation in his engineering ledger. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the summer air, mixing with darker scents he preferred not to contemplate. 17 days had passed since the battle ended, yet the land remained scarred, not just by artillery craters and trampled wheat fields, but by something deeper that Reed couldn't quite name. As an engineer with the Union Army Corps of Engineers, Reed had spent the past week methodically documenting structural damage across the battlefield. Bridge integrity, road conditions, artillery impact zones, all carefully measured and annotated in precise detail. It was the kind of methodical work that usually brought him comfort. Numbers didn't lie, measurements didn't deceive. Everything could be quantified, calculated, and explained through proper observation. Yet something about this survey felt different, the way sound carried oddly across Devil's Den, how the evening mist seemed to form shapes just at the edge of vision, the inexplicable cold spots they'd encounter, even in the July heat. His assistant, Corporal James Miller, had grown increasingly anxious as the days wore on, jumping at shadows and muttering prayers under his breath. "Sir," Miller called out now, his voice tight with barely contained tension. "The light's failing. Perhaps we should make our way back to camp." Reed checked his pocket watch, 7:42 p.m. They still had at least an hour of usable light, and he needed to complete his survey of the western ridge. "Just a few more measurements, Corporal. The War Department wants this report by month's end." As if in response to his words, a distant bugle call drifted across the battlefield. Reed frowned, checking his papers. There were no Union camps in that direction, and certainly no Confederate forces remained in the area. Before he could comment, Private Samuel Grayson emerged from the tree line, his weathered face unusually pale. "Captain," Grayson said quietly, "you need to see this, sir." Reed followed the private's gaze toward a cluster of broken cannon near the wheat field. Through the gathering dusk, a solitary figure in a Union uniform stood motionless among the wreckage, facing away from them. Something about the soldier's stillness made Reed's skin crawl. "Soldier," Reed called out, "this area is restricted to Engineering Corps personnel." The figure didn't move. As Reed watched, the evening mist seemed to curl around the soldier's boots, and for a moment, just a moment, Reed could have sworn he saw straight through the man's torso to the cannon behind him. Then the figure turned, revealing a face that would haunt Reed's nightmares for years to come. The soldier's face was a ghastly mask of torn flesh and shattered bone, yet his eyes burned with an unnatural alertness. "Water," he rasped, extending a trembling hand toward Reed. "Please, so thirsty." Reed instinctively reached for his canteen, military training overriding his growing sense of unreality. But in the split second he looked down, the figure vanished, leaving only empty air where he had stood. The evening mist swirled innocently through the space, carrying with it the faintest whisper of distant gunfire. "Mother of God," Miller whispered, crossing himself. Private Grayson remained silent, but his hand had moved to rest on his sidearm. Reed forced himself to approach the spot where the soldier had stood. The ground showed no footprints, no disturbance in the blood-enriched soil. Only the broken cannon remained, its barrel still pointing accusingly towards Cemetery Ridge, where Pickett's charge had met its bloody end. "Captain," Miller ventured, "the men have been talking about things they've seen, things they've heard." "Nonsense," Reed snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're all exhausted. The mind plays tricks in such conditions." But even as he spoke, the air grew unnaturally still. The natural sounds of evening, crickets, birds, the rustle of wind through the wheat, fell silent. In that vacuum of sound, they heard it, the rhythmic drumbeat of thousands of feet, marching in perfect cadence. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Sir," Grayson said quietly, "to hear is something you should know about the night of the 3rd of July, something I saw during the final hours of the battle." The old veteran's voice carried a weight that made Reed turn. In the gathering darkness, Grayson's features seemed to age a decade as he spoke. "I was with the 71st Pennsylvania, defending the wall at the angle. The Confederate artillery had just lifted, and through the smoke, we could see Pickett's men advancing. But there was something else moving with them, something wrong, shapes that didn't cast shadows, men who took direct hits and kept marching without bleeding. And behind our lines," Grayson's voice faltered. "Behind our lines," Reed prompted, "I saw men I knew were dead, men I'd watched fall hours before, back at their posts as if nothing had happened, looking just like that soldier we just saw. And they were all crying out the same thing." A distant bugle call echoed across the battlefield, playing an eerily familiar tune. Recognition dawned in Reed's mind just as Grayson finished his sentence. They were crying out that the battle wasn't over, that it would never be over. Reed spent that night in his tent, methodically reviewing his survey notes by lamplight. The rational part of his mind, the engineer who trusted in mathematics and measurable facts, tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. He'd drawn precise diagrams of where the spectral soldier had appeared, calculated sight lines, and noted atmospheric conditions. Yet none of these technical details could explain the impossible vision they'd encountered. A crack of thunder rattled his tent stakes. The summer storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, sending sheets of rain hammering against the canvas. Through the downpour, Reed heard urgent footsteps approaching. "Captain," Miller's voice called out, "you need to see this immediately, sir." The young corporal burst into the tent, rain-soaked and muddy. In his trembling hands, he held a leather document case, its surface caked with battlefield soil. "We found it exposed by the rainfall, sir, near where we were earlier." Reed carefully opened the waterlogged case. Inside, he found a Confederate dispatch dated the 3rd of July, 1863, the battle's final day. The paper was in remarkably good condition, the ink still legible despite its burial. As he read, his blood ran cold. The dispatch detailed planned Confederate troop movements that had never occurred, an entire regiment meant to support Pickett's charge from the southeast. But Reed knew from official battle records that this regiment had been decimated by a surprise Union ambush before reaching their position. The dispatches had never reached their intended recipient. "I hear is something else, sir," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. "We found it with these." He placed 3 brass uniform buttons on Reed's desk. They bore the insignia of the 118th Pennsylvania Infantry, a unit that had been positioned nowhere near where the dispatch was found. The buttons were heavily tarnished, save for clear fingerprints in the brass that looked freshly pressed. A sudden gust of wind extinguished Reed's lamp, plunging the tent into darkness. In the momentary blindness, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of boots squelching through mud, moving in formation. But this was impossible. The storm had turned the ground into an impassable quagmire. No troops could be drilling in these conditions. Then a voice cut through the darkness, clear, commanding, and terrifyingly close to the tent. "Rally on the colors. The 118th forms here." Reed relit his lamp with shaking hands. The voice had been so real, so present, yet when they looked outside, the rain fell on empty ground. Only the mud showed signs of disturbance, countless boot prints appearing in the soil, then filling with water and vanishing before their eyes. Dawn brought no relief. Reed's team moved their survey work to Devil's Den, where massive boulders still bore the scars of desperate close-quarters combat. The morning fog clung unusually thick around the rocks, defying the summer heat that should have burned it away. "The locals won't come near this place anymore," Grayson said, measuring the width of a cannon impact crater. "Say the rocks have been talking since the battle, whispering names of the dead." Reed ignored him, focusing on his calculations, but his pencil stopped mid-equation as an unfamiliar voice spoke directly behind him. "They're all still here, Captain. Both sides. Still fighting. Still dying." Reed spun to face an elderly woman in a black dress, her gray hair tied severely back. She hadn't been there seconds ago, and the boulder-strewn terrain offered no clear path for her approach. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military zone." Reed started, but she cut him off. "I am Abigail Warren. I've watched this battlefield since the guns fell silent, but they're never truly silent, are they?" Her eyes, sharp despite her age, fixed on Reed. "You've seen them too, the ones who don't know they're dead." Before Reed could respond, Miller called out from nearby, "Captain, we've found something in the rocks." Wedged between two boulders, they discovered a leather-bound journal. Its pages contained detailed sketches of Union troop positions, drawn from a vantage point that would have been behind Confederate lines. The final entry was dated the 2nd of July, written in an increasingly frantic hand. "They're coming up through the rocks, hundreds of them, but something's wrong. I've counted the same officer leading the charge 3 times now. I watched him die twice. Yet he keeps coming. They all keep coming. Dear God, what kind of hell is this?" "The artist was found here," Abigail said quietly, clutching his sketchbook, staring at nothing. His hair had gone completely white. A sudden cold wind whipped through the rocks, carrying with it the distant sound of drum and fife. Yankee Doodle played at double time, the traditional charge tempo. But the melody was wrong, distorted, as if the musicians were playing with shattered instruments. "Listen carefully, Captain." Abigail's voice took on an urgent tone. "The dead hold this ground now. They're trapped in their last moments, fighting battles that never end. But they're not the only things waiting in these rocks. There are older, darker things here, things that feed on all this death, things that want to keep the soldiers here, fighting forever." The old woman's words were drowned out by a sound that made Reed's heart stop, the distinctive rebel yell of a Confederate charge, echoing through rocks that should have been empty. The phantom rebel yell galvanized Reed into action. "Fall back to the hill," he ordered, his military training taking over. Their survey equipment lay forgotten as they scrambled up the rocky slope of Little Round Top. The fog followed them, writhing like a living thing. Through its shifting veils, Reed caught glimpses of movement among the rocks below, flashes of gray uniforms, glints of bayonets, shapes that appeared human until viewed directly. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible despite the July heat. "Do you understand now?" Abigail's voice came from beside them, though Reed hadn't seen her climb. The battle never ended. Not really. It just changed. A thunderous volley of musket fire erupted from the rocks. Reed instinctively dove for cover, but no bullets struck. Instead, the air filled with transparent shapes, Union and Confederate soldiers locked in spectral combat, their forms wavering like heat mirages. "Mother of mercy," Miller breathed, watching a ghostly Union color-bearer charge past, his flag riddled with phantom holes. The soldier's face was a mask of determination, until a Confederate bullet passed through his chest, and his expression transformed into one of eternal surprise. The scene shifted, showing the same color-bearer again, dying in a different way, then again and again. An endless loop of death played out before them. "Each death leaves a mark," Abigail explained, her voice distant. "A moment frozen in time, replaying forever. But something's changed. The cycles are speeding up. The barriers between then and now are wearing thin." As if to prove her point, a Confederate soldier stumbled through their group, quite solid and real-looking, until he passed straight through Miller, leaving a coating of frost on the corporal's uniform. The soldier turned, revealing a face that was somehow both young and ancient, his eyes filled with a madness born of endless battle. "Please," he begged, his voice echoing strangely. "I can't find my regiment. We were supposed to take the hill. We've been trying to take the hill for so long." The soldier's form began to fade, but his next words chilled Reed to his core. "The others are coming. The dark ones. They're using our pain, our deaths, building something. Growing stronger. You have to..." He vanished mid-sentence, leaving only his desperate warning hanging in the air. Above them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, turning the afternoon sky cemetery dark. Thunder rolled across the battlefield like phantom artillery. Reed realized with growing horror that they were no longer dealing with mere ghosts. something far worse was stirring on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The unnatural storm transformed day into night. Lightning illuminated the battlefield in stark bursts, revealing masses of soldiers appearing and disappearing with each flash. The air grew heavy with more than just rain, thick with the accumulated weight of thousands of violent deaths. "They're all falling into alignment," Abigail warned, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "Every death, every horror, every moment of suffering, it's all building to something, tonight." Reed watched in mounting dread as phantom regiments began forming up across the field, Union and Confederate lines assembling for what he recognized as Pickett's charge. But something was wrong. The spectral soldiers moved with jerking, unnatural motions. Their faces flickered between human features and something darker, more ancient. "It's not just the soldiers anymore," Grayson shouted above the storm. "Look at their eyes." Lightning flashed again, and Reed saw what the veteran meant. Many of the apparitions now had eyes that glowed with an eldritch light, not the eyes of dead soldiers, but of something inhuman wearing their forms like ill-fitting uniforms. The Phantom Army began to advance, but this was no mere replay of history. Confederate and Union spirits moved as one now, a tide of the damned surging toward Little Round Top. Leading them was the blood-soaked soldier they'd first encountered, no longer asking for water, but screaming battle commands in a voice that shook the earth. "The veil's tearing," Abigail cried out. "The darkness that feeds on their pain. It's using their eternal battle to break through." Reed watched in horror as the phantom soldiers began to solidify, becoming more real with each step. The ground frosted beneath their feet. Their touch began leaving scorched handprints on the rocks. The barrier between past and present, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, was dissolving. Miller turned to flee but froze mid-step. Surrounding them on all sides were dark shapes rising from the ground, shadowy forms suggesting military uniforms but composed of pure darkness. Their features were wounds in reality, bleeding a deeper darkness that consumed the storm's lightning. "What we saw before," Reed whispered, understanding finally dawning. "Those weren't ghosts replaying their deaths. They were warnings, the dead trying to alert us, trying to prevent this." Thunder that sounded suspiciously like laughter rolled across the battlefield. The Shadow Army drew closer, and in their midst, something vast and ancient began to take form, something that had been feeding on death and suffering since the first human picked up a weapon in anger. The true horror of Gettysburg was about to reveal itself. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a scene from mankind's darkest nightmares. The entity emerging from the Phantom Army towered above the battlefield, a writhing mass of darkness, wearing the combined agony of every soldier who had died at Gettysburg. Thousands of faces pressed outward from within its form, their mouths open in silent screams that spoke of eternal torment. "It's been feeding," Abigail's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a surgeon's knife, growing stronger with each death, each replayed battle, using their pain to break through. Her eyes locked with Reed's, and in them he saw not fear, but recognition. But that's also its weakness. What feeds it can starve it. Reed watched the entity's writhing form, his engineer's mind racing. All these months documenting the horror, measuring the impossible, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. But the answer wasn't in his calculations or surveys. It had been in front of him all along, written in every face that emerged from that dark mass. The entity wasn't just feeding on the soldiers' suffering. It was bound to it, chained to their endless battle, their eternal pain. And in that moment, Reed understood what no equation could explain. The way to end a war wasn't with more fighting, but with peace. "Miller," Reed's voice carried the weight of revelation. "Your bugle." The corporal hesitated only a second before tossing him the instrument. In that moment, Reed remembered every ghost they'd encountered, the blood-soaked soldier begging for water, the Confederate lost without his regiment, faces young and old trapped in their final moments of horror. They weren't just haunts or variables in some cosmic equation. They were soldiers, sons, brothers, Americans. Reed raised the bugle to his lips and began to play, not a call to battle or retreat, but the haunting notes of taps, the soldiers' final farewell. The melody floated across the battlefield like a benediction, each note a permission to finally rest. The effect was electric. The phantom soldiers paused their advance as recognition flickered across their spectral faces. The dark entity writhed as if each note physically wounded it. Through its shifting mass, Reed saw faces he knew, their expressions transforming as the madness of endless battle gave way to remembrance, to understanding, to peace. Let them rest. Abigail's voice rang out with the power of a cannon shot. The war is over. Your hold on them ends now. By all that's holy, let them rest. The entity shrieked, a sound that contained every battlefield cry ever uttered, from ancient Rome to Gettysburg, and tried to pull its army forward. But the soldiers were transforming. Their spectral forms straightened, uniforms mending, wounds healing. One by one, they lowered their weapons. Union and Confederate alike, they stood at attention, one final time, not as enemies, but as brothers in arms, facing a common foe. The dark shape thrashed violently, its form unraveling as thousands of years of captured battle pain began to slip through its grasp. The faces within its mass started to fade, each finding the peace that had eluded them in death. A blast of cold wind howled across the battlefield, and the entity imploded with a thunder that shook the hills of Gettysburg to their foundations. In the sudden silence that followed, Reed watched the phantom soldiers begin to disappear, not in violence or terror, but with quiet dignity. Blue and gray alike, they faded like mist in morning sun. The Confederate soldier who had warned them paused before vanishing, touching his cap in salute. His eyes were human again, clear and bright with final understanding. Then he too was gone, leaving only peace behind. Dawn broke over Gettysburg. The only evidence of the night's events was a strange pattern of frost on the rocks, already melting in the July sun. Reed looked to where Abigail had stood, but the old woman had vanished like the phantom army she'd helped set free. Years later, when asked about his official report, Reed would simply say he documented what an engineer could verify: damage to bridges, roads, and fortifications. But his private journal, found after his death in 1899, told a different story. Its final entry read, "The dead at Gettysburg numbered over 50,000, but numbers can't capture what happened here. Some wounds run too deep for mathematics to measure. Some battles don't end with the last shot fired, and some darknesses never truly leave. They just wait, feeding on our pain until we're ready to face them again." But I learned something that night, something no engineering manual could teach. The greatest weapon against darkness isn't more darkness. It's peace, it's remembrance, it's letting go. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear taps playing across those quiet fields. And I remember how the simple notes of a bugle accomplished what no army could. They brought our boys, blue and gray alike, home at last. If this tale from the War Maestro's Archive has haunted your barracks, consider joining our ranks. Subscribe to uncover more classified horrors from military history, and hit that notification bell to know when our next dark file is declassified. Share this story with those who know the battlefield holds secrets darker than war itself. Leave a comment below. Have you encountered unexplainable phenomena during your service? Or perhaps you have your own ghostly tale from the killing fields to share. Remember, some battles never truly end. They just wait for new soldiers to witness them.